Okay, so Zion Williamson is out indefinitely with a left hamstring strain. Does that mean it's time for the Pelicans to move on from the Zion era? It's the Wednesday episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans and NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with y'all on this Wednesday, and we are going to have some interesting conversations in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans, talking about the Zion Williamson injury situation. Is this basically an inflection point, a breaking point for him and the New Orleans Pelicans? And what do you do going forward with this? We'll also look at Jose Alvarado's injury as well. So we got a lot to cover in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. And of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well and become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to Locked On Pelicans. Okay, so let's get into the Zion Williamson discussion and the meat of like whether or not they should stick with him or not. I want to get into the next segment. I want to look at this. The other day when discussing this, and I feel this even more strongly now from talking to even more people around the team, truthfully. I said the other day that I think this is a bit of a blameless situation. And I stand by that. This is a situation where Zion did all of the right things this offseason, stayed healthy last year too, and just an injury came up. And it sucks. And it's one of those things where, look, Zion should be given the credit for getting his body where it needs to be. He was healthy overall. He was in shape this offseason. He was in really great shape in training camp. He's been focused on stretching and taking care of his body in a preventative way like that. It's really just a situation of bad luck and his body not responding to him playing basketball in a way that he or any of us would like. He did all of the right things, and I don't think this is a failure on the medical staff, even with all the injuries right now, too. They revamped that, and last year, they were healthy because of that new way they approach things. Sometimes it just simply is bad luck. But here's what I want to say with that. The issue is still coming up even when they did all of the right things, and that's not good. This is the fourth significant hamstring injury that Zion Williamson has suffered. So while Zion has improved in all of that off-court stuff, there's clearly still more to do. And now it's on Zion to say basically enough is enough and do everything he can to remedy this and prevent it going forward. I don't blame him for getting hurt. It happens. He thought he was doing enough of what he needed to do based off the health of last season, even though it ended with a hamstring injury. But it's clear that while, yes, he's doing a lot of the right things and he's improved as like a professional and all that, there's still a whole lot more that needs to be done here. So if he thought he was doing enough, this should be, I don't want to call it a wake-up call. This should just be a moment where he goes, oh, I've got to do even more than that. So, what's that look like? It's finding a lot of the right people. And this is something that, if we could go back in time, would have been great to have done his rookie year, but obviously that wasn't the case. More or less, he just needs to throw money at this problem. You got to pay for multiple personal trainers, personal ships, whatever it might be. And he's doing a lot of that already. You got to do even more. And maybe your agency helps, maybe the Pelicans help, whatever it is, you've got to get the right people to prevent this from happening ever again. With how much of his career has been derailed by injuries and now 4 significant hamstring injuries, you've got to do what you can. Maybe it's more stretching, maybe it's other preventative maintenance and things like that. That's what needs to be done. Zion should be at this point, going forward, exhausting all options to prevent hamstring injuries or really any sort of leg injuries. His legs were not holding up this season, even in good shape. You had the right hamstring strain, the right thigh soreness, and now a left hamstring injury, which probably, even though I'm not a doctor or an expert here, came from like subconsciously, indirectly overcompensating for the right leg not feeling correct. But again, no one's to blame here. The medical staff cleared him. He felt good. And then the next day, basically, things didn't seem like it was going well. This situation today, this exact one is blameless. But look, Zion hasn't been blameless his whole career. He only recently started taking this stuff seriously. And look, the Pelicans also didn't put enough boundaries and kind of enforce them and keep him on rails here. Though, could they actually have done anything that he would have listened to? I don't know. So, in a sense, maybe some of the work that he's doing now is undoing like some of the lack of stuff beforehand. And maybe it's a little bit too little too late. And this doesn't just go for the Pelicans here with Zion. This just goes for Zion if he wants to have a long and healthy career in the NBA and a legacy. He's got to play. And now, even though he did all of the right stuff, and I think this is why you'll maybe hear, about his mentals and things like that, it's probably dragging on him that he did all the right things and still his body is not responding in a way that he wants. It's rough. It sucks. It really sucks for Zion because I can tell you for a fact he wants to play. But this just says there's more work to be done. And while he took good steps this offseason towards doing everything he needs to do, and he should be given credit for that, there's clearly more work that needs to be done on this sort of thing. And he's got to go out and do it. And that's going to be a real key part to all of this. He's got to go out and do all of that to just try and improve and be better and all of those things to prevent this from happening. And if he wants his career to be here or elsewhere, he'd like his career to be here, I believe that. But if he just wants to have an NBA career, the way he's been going isn't it, and something more needs to be done. Needs to be going to the end of the earth, exhausting all options, throwing as much money at the problem as possible to try and prevent this from ever happening again, because it's really basically at this point derailed an already, a career that had so much promise to it. And if you're the Pelicans and he's not going to go to the ends of the earth here, is this something that you can keep building around? And I think this question is now very, very valid. He silenced a lot of those doubts last year, and now new doubts come up. And I want to look at that. Is it just too little too late for Zion and the Pelicans? Do they need to kind of move on from this era? Let's look at that coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle all the NFL and NBA action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL and NBA all in one place. When you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you realize momentum's going a certain way. Your team is surging. They're going to win even though they weren't favored before, or maybe they're just down close at halftime. You get the updated live odds. Those are changing throughout the game, adjusting to the ebb and flow of it. If you know it's going to go a certain way, you got that hunch, you can make the most of it over at FanDuel. You can also check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. And all you need to do is just visit FanDuel.com today. You're going to get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Pelicans taking on the Oklahoma City Thunder. Thunder favored by -4.5 in this game. Does New Orleans have an upset with them? Or the Thunder, with their own injury to Chet Holmgren, going to run away with it? So you can get started over at FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well, and become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to Locked On Pelicans. And now your favorite podcast has a newsletter here, introducing the Locked On Pelicans daily newsletter, one stop for ultimate team and league coverage. We hired some great writers. I write every day for it. It's all delivered right to your inbox. Sign up for free now at LockedOnDaily.com. That's LockedOnDaily.com, and start your day with the all-new free Locked On Pelicans newsletter. So let's get into the big topic here, and I'm curious what you have to say. Let me know in the comments down below on YouTube. So truly do think of this as a bit of a blameless injury right now. Shows there's more work that needs to be done. But look, we thought this was all put to bed after last season when Zion played healthy. Even with the injury in the play-in tournament game, he played 70 games. That silenced a lot of the concern I think we had about him, was like, show that. Well, now it's come back up again, so I guess it didn't actually mean the problem was solved. Is this an inflection point for Zion to get better, as we talked about, even more better than he's already been doing? I think he's been trending in the right direction. Is this an inflection point for him to do even more better, like next year with the team? Let's say they tank or whatever, and trust me, we're going to be having that discussion soon. Or does it even matter? Is it just time to move on from Zion in some capacity here? To quote Mike Detillier, you know him, the best ability is availability. And look, that just hasn't been the case. Zion is clearly a guy and a talented enough player that you can build around him in terms of just talent when he's out there on the court. But if you're going to miss more games than you've played, and he did all of the right, I'm telling y'all, he took care of himself this offseason. He was in good shape, right? This wasn't supposed to happen, and then it did. So even if he's taking really good care of himself, and it still happens, what can you do, right? One of the things that I've seen in a lot of stuff in life is like, when it just feels like there's always something, and it just is never not something that's stopping things from being good, whatever that is, work, relationship, whatever you have. That's an exhausting feeling. We've probably all been there. It's an exhausting feeling. And at a certain point, you just have to walk away because it's just not good for you. Is that what this is for Zion Williamson and the Pelicans, right? Even in what was, maybe considered a best case scenario this offseason, injuries are still coming up, right? If they're still happening, is there a way to remedy this? Is there a way to fix this? How much can you keep kind of trying to build around someone who doesn't play, even though he's more talented than anyone else that you have? And I think that's a valid question to ask right now. If he was healthy right now, we wouldn't be having this discussion, right? Even with all the other injuries, if they were losing games, as long as Zion was playing, it's like, well, that's the dude that you're building around, so that's good. But he's not here right now, even when he did all of the right things. And maybe there's just no one to blame in that, and it just is a crappy situation. And it feels like that might be the case here. And so that's kind of what I think people are feeling a lot of right now, is like, yeah, as talented as he is, even if he's doing all of the right things, and maybe you don't think he is, whatever, you just can't do this anymore. And I get that. And I wonder if the front office, if the team is feeling that way too, of like, how much more can we take of this? They're like, it's basically like, this isn't a way to live, right? That's kind of the way I'm feeling here. Like, this isn't fun when it's something like this, right? And it's always something. And so I do wonder, and this is where it gets even more interesting, if that's something that the Pelicans are really going to start to evaluate this season, this offseason, whatever it might be. It's likely this offseason. You're not going to trade Zion in the middle of the year. I don't think he's got tons and tons of value around the league right now after the injuries and everything and all of that. So I think that's something where we're going to just have to grin and bear it and tough out this season, let's say. Maybe they get back healthy and everything's good. And it's going to be interesting to compare his recovery to somebody else's, Jose's in particular, which we'll talk about in the next segment here. The people that are going to make that decision. So I said, this is what I find interesting about it. Is this something that the team, and I specifically said the team needs to evaluate and will think about, right? David Griffin's not going to think about trading away Zion Williamson for draft picks and young players or whatever you could get for him. That's a surefire way to get fired, right? If he does that, you're not going to let him rebuild the team. He's going to lose his job. So Griff probably isn't thinking about trading away and starting a rebuild because he won't be the guy in charge of that. You could trade him away and get all those assets and picks and let the next guy take over and run everything. That is how that would go. So when I say, is this something that the team is thinking about, I mean at an ownership level. And that comes to Gail Benson, Lauscha, and like that kind of group of folks. The brain trust, the proxies for ownership, all of that. Is that who's maybe like, we can't keep doing this? They clearly heard the pressure from the fans about Dennis Allen when it came to the Saints, and that like the fan base was ready to revolt. I was ready to revolt. They didn't fire him soon. They were going to fire him after the end of the season, but firing him just in the middle of the season made us all feel better, right? At a certain point, you've just got to be like, our fans are not happy. And while I think people are still going to go to the games and all that, I'm not worried about that stuff. If they feel like we just can't keep building or gaining traction with the way this team is, like, do they just clean house and start fresh and try and go about it a different way? That's a tough pill to swallow. That's going to be an ownership decision, not a David Griffin decision, in my opinion. If anything, it would be ownership fires David Griffin after this season. Then the new person they hire comes in and just remakes the roster by trading away Zion or whatever other pieces you want, or however you want to go about doing it. I've said, and a couple of y'all have said this in the comments actually, that like I think it is worth going down with the Zion ship. But truthfully, after this injury, when he did all of the right things, and he did, and it still didn't work, that's like the definition of going down with the ship. Was like, we tried, didn't work out. He's injured. This team's struggling. They're on a 5-game losing streak. We'll see when that ends. And now, what do you do? This is what going down with the ship feels like. I think it was the correct move. And sometimes just things outside of your control sink you here. Zion's injuries, all of that. But it should have been fixed by now. He did all the right things, and these injuries are still happening, and the team's in somewhat of disarray when it comes to all of that. So I think at this point, unless the season dramatically turns around, and look, I'm not ruling that out. There's enough talent here that I do think fits well together, especially with the emergence of Yves Missi, that they can maybe make a run. If you were in the Eastern Conference right now, we wouldn't be concerned about this. Only 2 teams are above 500 in the East. The Cavaliers at 12-0 and Boston at 9-2. Indiana's 3 at 5-5, right? New Orleans would be right in the running when it comes to, a playoff spot and not falling too far behind in the East. There's 10 teams above 500 in the Western Conference right now. That's where you start to fall behind pretty quickly. In the other conference, not a big deal. Here, yeah. And at a certain point, yeah, you can make a run late, but if it's too little, too late, something that I've been saying a lot on the show, that's not, a great position to be in. The Pelicans are already 4 games back of the 6th seed. Now, that doesn't mean too much this early, but if that keeps growing, that can be a challenge to overcome. They're 3 games out right now of the 10th spot. That's not a great position to be in. If it maintains that, that's one thing. If the Pelicans start winning games, but you look at their upcoming schedule, OKC, Denver, the Lakers, and others here, it doesn't feel particularly great, and that's a concern, I think. So that's kind of where things stand. That leads to the tanking conversation, which we'll be doing throughout this week and next week, I think. We'll recap the game on Thursday. Friday, we'll get you set for the weekend too, and maybe talk about some of the tanking and how this weekend could be a little bit of make or break with that. But there definitely feels like you're kind of on the precipice of something not great here in New Orleans, which is wild to say after just 11 games to start the season. That's not where we really expected this team to be, but this is what injuries do to you. They're kind of the great equalizer in all of this, and sometimes they're not things you can control. And again, I don't really think that the player performance, the care team, the medical staff, whatever you want to call it, is at a ton of fault for this, even with multiple hamstrings and things like that have occurred on this team. They revamped it. They were healthy last year. Maybe last year was the fluke, and this year is more of the reality, but there's no way to really know that for sure at this point in time. So TBD on, whether I think the jury's still a little bit out on that, but I think I err on the side of like, they were healthy last year. That's a really good thing, and they did a good job of all of that. But it does feel like maybe it's time to just move on, because more or less you can't keep living this way, I think. And that's truthfully how I feel a little bit about it. Like, I'm not ready to pull the plug. I want to see how the season goes. We're not going to do knee-jerk reactions here, but you can. That's totally fair. Let me know in the comments down below. But it's not good. It's not good. And I don't know if this is necessarily fixable exactly right now. We'll see. Let's see what happens when they get some guys back and what kind of difference that ends up making here. So coming up next, Jose Alvarado is now out injured. I'll give you the expected timeline here. What's going to be there's something super interesting about that. There's something super interesting about Jose Alvarado's injury and Zion's injury at the same time. I want to look at that. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by Mint Mobile. With big wireless providers, what you see is never what you get. Somewhere between the store and your first month's bill, the price you thought you were paying magically skyrockets. But with Mint Mobile, you'll never have to worry about gotchas ever again. When Mint Mobile says $15 a month when you purchase a 3-month plan, they mean it. So say bye-bye to your overpriced wireless plans, jaw-dropping monthly bills, and unexpected overages. Mint Mobile is here to rescue you with premium wireless plans starting at $15 a month. All plans come with high-speed data and unlimited talk and text delivered to the nation's largest 5G network. Use your own phone with any Mint Mobile plan and bring your phone number along with all your existing contacts. Ditch the overpriced wireless with Mint Mobile's deal and get 3 months of premium wireless service for $15 a month. To get this new customer offer and your new 3-month premium wireless plan for just $15 a month, go to mintmobile.com/lockedonnba. That's mintmobile.com/lockedonnba. Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/lockedonnba. $45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. For your second listen, go check out the Locked On Saints podcast. Ross Jackson breaking down everything black and gold. I don't know if there's anyone better in the biz when it comes to that. He's talking all things new head coach and what it's going to mean for the offseason. Go make Locked On Saints your second listen today, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So let's start to wrap up the show. More injury news, because what's new with this team right now, right? Like, this is just one of those seasons that we'll compare it to the Memphis Grizzlies last year, where they were just decimated by injuries all year long and what it meant for them and their rebuild too, because I do think that's worth looking at as well, and put this in some historical context as well. The Pelicans announced that guard Jose Alvarado has been diagnosed with a left hamstring strain, words I never want to hear again. An MRI taken this morning confirmed the injury, which occurred during last night's game against the Brooklyn Nets. He will be re-examined in approximately 3 weeks. When Shams put it out, he said 4 to 6 weeks. It's an identical injury, as far as we know, to Zion Williamson's injury here. Shams on Zion said 4 to 6 weeks. The team did not say 4 to 6 weeks. We don't know the grades of the hamstring strains. There are grades to them, so one might be worse than the other. But it'll be interesting to see that 2 players basically diagnosed at the same time with the same injury, what their recovery processes look like, and who is back out there on the court first. Zion doesn't tend to hit those marks. We'll see if that's a little bit different this year. We'll see what happens with Jose Alvarado here. But I do think kind of looking at that, not that it's an apples to apples comparison, even with a similar, the same injury and the same timeline. People's bodies are different and they respond differently to things. So don't read too much into that, but I do think it's something we should look at here. And I wonder if that somehow, motivates Zion or helps Zion in some capacity when it comes to all this. It's just rough. This injury I have some questions about. In the game against the Orlando Magic on Friday, late in the fourth quarter, when the game was already decided and the Pelicans were losing, Jose was still in and did appear to tweak his left hamstring. And you saw him kind of limping a little bit, tried to play through it. Honestly, I was a little bit frustrated with that, because at that point in time, anyone who mattered for the team should have been pulled. There's no point in having guys out there to risk injury and that sort of thing. Not that you expect injuries. Maybe you should with this team. But he probably should have been pulled in like a 20-point game, where what's the point of keeping him out there? And if he suffered the injury because of that, that's not great. And then if he then tried to just play through it against the Brooklyn Nets, which it seemed like he did, it seemed early on in the first half he kind of tweaked it. He did go to the locker room. He came back, tried to play through it. He threw a towel on the ground at one point. I think he was frustrated. That begs the question of, could this have been prevented? And I think that's where some of this, I don't have much to say about the medical staff. There's so much we don't know. They revamped it here. But if they left him in that game when they should have pulled him, and it's not just from an injury thing, it was just, what was the point at that, at that time of the game and what situation of the game and what the score was. And, your starters aren't going to do anything there, and he started that game. So you have that. And then with Zion coming back from the locker room, starting the second half against the Cavaliers, should they have done imaging immediately after that game as opposed to just on Saturday? And did Zion go through another practice or something from that? Should he have traveled with the team for a one-game road trip to Orlando? Should he have just stayed home? All of those things kind of beg the question. That's where, if you want to kind of get into like there's malpractice and issues going on, I think you have a bit of a claim, maybe not much of one because we don't know enough. That's where it would be, but I don't think they're doing something wrong when the players are here, because these guys were healthy last year and we didn't see this sort of stuff. So it just sucks. Like, injuries suck. There's just no other word for it. I do think the Pels need to at least examine their player performance and care team again. I think that's always an ongoing thing, and don't think it's like, well, they're like, no, we just redid it, we're fine. I think they'll, of course, be reviewing it. I'm sure they reviewed it after last year, too. That's kind of what all teams do, is you evaluate things top to bottom every single year to see where you can improve. But this is just, it's not like a stealth tank or anything like that. These guys are just getting injured. And Tom Haberstroh of Yahoo just wrote an article yesterday about this too, that injuries are on the rise around the NBA. So it's not just a Pelicans thing. No team has the injuries to the degree that the Pels do, especially to like main players, key guys for your team. But this is something that's kind of a bit of an epidemic problem around the league here that the league does need to sort out. But it sucks for Jose, who was playing really well, played really well with Puerto Rico in the Olympics, had a pretty good start to the year here for New Orleans as well. So we will see how quickly guys get back. So on the other injury front, since that's what we're talking about today, we got Trey back. I think in 2 weeks you'll probably get CJ McCollum back. Then maybe 2 weeks after that, one of DeJounte Murray or Herb Jones. And then 2 weeks after that, the other guy. It does seem like there's going to be kind of being like a rolling basis to guys returning, and maybe that helps. Obviously, it'll help. Just getting more talent on this team is going to help. That'll maybe get you some wins, and maybe it means you can get healthy, and then you can go on a run late in the year. We saw that a little bit with the Houston Rockets, right? They went on a run at the end of the year, but it was too little too late. Hopefully that's not going to be the case for New Orleans. We'll look at tanking. We'll look at playing for a top pick, maybe on Friday, maybe on Tuesday or so on the show here, but that's something we got to look at. What I need to do and what I'm planning to do is a little bit of research on teams that kind of were good, had a ton of injuries, got a lottery pick, and then immediately bounced back to the playoffs, and like, what was their process? I guarantee you the Pelicans are actually doing that. Because they've also done it years past. So that's something that we'll discuss here. We'll look at tanking, we'll look at the draft and all that stuff, and just kind of get an overview of like, what should the Pelicans do? So that's going to be coming up later this week and next week here on Locked On Pelicans. And that's going to do it for this episode of Locked On Pelicans, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Be back with you all tomorrow to recap the game. Don't get hurt, because it seems like everybody else is. See y'all next time.